The grand forum of the Stellar Alliance echoed with voices from 100 species, their tones a mix of commands, arguments, and indifference. It was a place where empires negotiated peace and war, where monarchs and diplomats shaped the fate of the galaxy. And yet, Princess Lyra of the Skelna went unseen. She stood just under a meter tall, her slender figure barely noticeable amidst the towering forms of delegates twice or thrice her size. The Skelna were a race known for their agility and intellect, but their stature, so small compared to the galactic norm, had long consigned them to irrelevance. Lyra felt every bit of it. The princess wore royal robes of silver and indigo, fabrics woven from her homeworld's finest threads. A delicate crown of iridescent crystals sat atop her head, shimmering in the forum's artificial light. She walked with her head held high, but her violet eyes couldn't hide her pain. "I see the midget princess has arrived," a low voice muttered from nearby. Lyra's chest tightened. Her people were mocked across the alliance. The Skelna, once innovators, had been forgotten as the galaxy's giants claimed dominance. Her diminutive size made it worse. Every alien male dismissed her as a child, a curiosity at best. Unworthy. She swallowed her pride, pretending not to hear. As the Orakian general, a 6-foot-tall brute with skin like molten stone, sauntered past her, he sneered. "A princess no one wants." What a tragedy. Her hands clenched under her flowing sleeves, nails biting into her palms. She couldn't afford to lose composure here. This was her father's final hope for Skelna recognition, her mission. But every snide remark, every stare that passed through her like she was air, eroded her will. The galaxy had no place for someone like her, or so they believed. At the far end of the forum hall, a man in a dark Earth Coalition uniform leaned against a marble column. His posture was casual but observant, his steel-blue eyes scanning the delegates with a soldier's vigilance. This was Captain Marcus Hale, a seasoned human officer assigned to the Alliance's diplomatic security detail. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short brown hair and a scar running across his jaw, Marcus looked as out of place as Lyra felt. Only, in his case, it seemed intentional. As his gaze swept over the hall, he noticed her. The small princess stood out, not for her size, but for the dignity with which she carried herself. Unlike the loud, imposing delegates, she moved quietly, deliberately, a lone star in the vast black void of space. He frowned. "Who's she?" A nearby officer chuckled. "That's Princess Lyra of the Skelna, Galaxy's most irrelevant royal. Poor thing's been rejected by every diplomat and alien prince from here to the edge of the void." Marcus arched a brow. "Rejected? Yep. Their males are small too, but she's different. No one takes her seriously. Honestly, I'm surprised she bothers showing up." Marcus didn't like the tone. He glanced back at the princess and caught something fleeting in her expression. An exhaustion she hid well, a vulnerability under all that stoic composure. He'd seen it before. The look of someone fighting not to break. And he respected that. Lyra stepped onto a small balcony, away from the sneering crowd. She needed air, a moment to breathe. The massive spires of the Forum City rose around her, their golden hues glowing under 3 setting suns. Lyra gripped the railing, letting the silence wash over her. "I'm wasting my time," she whispered to no one. "They'll never listen." "Giving up already?" The voice startled her. She spun around, startled to find Marcus standing a few feet away. He raised his hands in mock surrender. "Didn't mean to scare you." Her gaze narrowed. "Who are you?" "Captain Marcus Hale. Human Coalition," he said, stepping closer. "I was just making sure you weren't about to jump off the balcony." Lyra blinked. "What?" "I know." Marcus grinned, unfazed. "Good to hear." Silence lingered between them. Lyra's small frame was almost comical next to Marcus's towering form, but he didn't look at her with pity or condescension. He simply looked, like she was someone worth seeing. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Just observing," he said with a shrug. "Though I admit I was curious. Everyone in there seems to either ignore you or insult you. Can't figure out why." "Because I'm small. Because I'm Skelna." Her voice was flat. "My people aren't important." Marcus crossed his arms. "Important to who?" "To the galaxy," Lyra replied bitterly. "Well, the galaxy sounds like an idiot," Marcus said bluntly. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "I mean it. You're here, aren't you? Carrying yourself like you belong, even when they act like you don't. I'd say it takes more guts than any of those blustering giants in there." For the first time in days, Lyra felt her shoulders relax, if only a little. Marcus's words weren't flowery or political. They were just honest, and honesty was something she'd been starved for. "You're a strange human, Captain Hale," she said quietly. "Marcus," he corrected, smiling. "And you're not nearly as insignificant as they think you are, Princess Lyra." A faint flush rose to her cheeks. She turned back toward the city, hiding a small, grateful smile. Marcus stayed by her side, staring out at the sprawling skyline. For him, this was just another day at work, but for Lyra, it was the first time someone had seen her not as a joke, not as a failure, but as a person. And in the quiet of that balcony, something sparked between them, a small connection in a galaxy that had always felt too big. Lyra didn't know it yet, but this human soldier would change her fate, and perhaps her fate would change his too. For the first time in years, Princess Lyra didn't feel invisible. Captain Marcus Hale had said so little, yet his words stayed with her like a warmth she hadn't realized she was missing. She had no illusions. Marcus was a stranger, a soldier from a distant world, here out of obligation. But he saw her. That, in itself, was rare enough to be precious. The silence stretched between them as they stood on the balcony, looking over the glowing expanse of the Forum City. Marcus finally broke it, his tone casual. "So what brings a princess to this circus?" Lyra tilted her head, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "I thought you were just observing." "I am. But observation tends to raise questions." He turned, leaning against the railing. "Call it human curiosity." Lyra sighed softly. "My father sent me to make an appeal for Skelna recognition. He believes the Stellar Alliance is our last chance to rebuild our place in the galaxy." Marcus frowned. "Rebuild? Our people weren't always this diminished. We were once architects of progress, innovators of technology, the galaxy envied. But when larger species rose to power, we were dismissed, seen as weak and expendable. Over time, our name faded into obscurity." Marcus's gaze hardened, a spark of something indignant flashing in his eyes. "They turned their backs on you because you weren't big enough for their standards." Lyra shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, though bitterness clung to her voice. "The galaxy values power above all else. My father believes I can prove we're more than our size, that we still have worth." "And do you?" Marcus asked, his tone direct but gentle. Lyra turned sharply, glaring at him as if he'd insulted her. "Of course I do." Marcus raised his hands in surrender, an amused smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Good. I figured as much." Lyra blinked, caught off guard by his response. "You're very strange for a human." Marcus chuckled. "I get that a lot." He shifted slightly, his expression growing more serious. "But here's the thing, Princess. Believing in your worth is only the start. If you're going to convince a room full of self-important aliens, you'll need to prove it. Show them something they can't ignore." Lyra frowned. "And how do you suggest I do that?" "They don't listen to me." "You make them listen," Marcus said simply. "You're small, sure, but that's not a weakness. It's a weapon. You're quick, smart, and most importantly, underestimated. Use it." Lyra stared at him, her violet eyes wide. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Not with such confidence, not with the belief that she could do something. For a moment, she felt as though a door had been cracked open. "You talk as though I'm preparing for war," she said quietly. Marcus's expression didn't waver. "Diplomacy is its own kind of battlefield, Princess, and in my experience, the smallest fighters often win the biggest fights." Before she could respond, a sudden loud chime echoed through the air, a signal that the forum would soon resume. Marcus straightened. "Duty calls," he said, a little regretful. "But hey, give 'em hell in there, Princess." Lyra watched as he turned and strode back into the corridors of the Great Hall. For a long moment, she stayed where she was, Marcus's words replaying in her mind. Make them listen. Show them something they can't ignore. Her father's voice always echoed in her head. Be quiet, be respectful, wait for them to see reason. But what if waiting wasn't enough? What if Marcus was right? The next session of the forum was already underway when Lyra entered. The council chamber was alive with the voices of towering diplomats and generals, debating the merits of a proposed trade alliance between the larger empires. Lyra, as always, had been given a small seat near the edge of the room, far from the central platform. But this time, she didn't sit down. Instead, she stepped forward, her small form approaching the Grand Speaker's podium. The murmurs started immediately, some curious, others amused. The Orakian general was among the first to sneer. The Skelna wished to speak. What can a species so small have to say? Lyra ignored him. She climbed the steps to the podium, her heartbeat thundering in her chest. She gripped its edge to steady herself, her voice soft but clear when she spoke. The Skelna do not ask for pity. We do not ask for favors. We ask for recognition, for the right to stand as equals in this galaxy. Her words rang out, surprisingly strong for someone so small. For a brief second, silence fell over the chamber, but it didn't last. She wastes our time. A delegate from the Zentari Collective barked. The galaxy has no need for insects. Laughter rippled through the room, sharp and humiliating. Lyra's vision blurred, but then, "You heard the princess," a deep voice boomed. Lyra turned in shock to see Marcus standing at the edge of the hall, his coalition uniform gleaming under the lights. He crossed his arms, his voice carrying easily. "Seems to me she's braver than half of you combined. Maybe you should hear her out before dismissing her." The room quieted. Lyra stared at him, words catching in her throat. Marcus gave her a small, encouraging nod. And suddenly, she found her voice again. "You laugh at my people's size," Lyra continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But it is not size that wins wars, that builds civilizations. It is ingenuity, resilience, unity. My people may be small, but our strength lies in what we create, in how we endure." Her voice grew louder, her conviction undeniable. "If the Stellar Alliance values only strength of muscle and size, then it is doomed to fall. Because true strength lies in how you rise, even when the galaxy pushes you down." The silence that followed was heavier this time. Marcus smiled from his place near the door, his chest swelling with pride. Lyra stepped back from the podium, her hands trembling. She didn't know if her words had changed anything yet, but for the first time she didn't feel invisible. And across the chamber, as the towering delegates murmured among themselves, some began to look at the small princess with new eyes. For Marcus, one thing was clear: the galaxy had been wrong about her, and they wouldn't ignore her for much longer. Princess Lyra's footsteps echoed through the long marble corridors of the Grand Forum. The air was heavy, and though her body trembled, her face remained stoic, regal. She had delivered her words with all the strength she could muster. Now, as she walked away from the podium, the weight of what she had done began to settle. Behind her, whispers followed like ghosts: disbelief, mockery, surprise. But something new lingered as well: curiosity. Lyra's fingers curled around the edges of her flowing sleeves, knuckles white. She had spoken out when her people expected her to bow, when the galaxy expected her to shrink. For once, the Skelna were seen, not as a joke, but as a force that refused to fade quietly into the void. But what came next? As she rounded a corner, her path was suddenly blocked by the molten-skinned Orakian general. His glowing red eyes bore into her like twin suns. "You've grown bold, little insect," he hissed, his voice low. "But words mean nothing in this hall. The Eskelna will remain forgotten." Lyra stared up at the giant alien, her heart hammering in her chest, but she didn't back down. "Then it's a shame, General, that someone so large fears the words of someone so small." A rumble of anger vibrated through him, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "You're in my way, General." Captain Marcus Hale stepped into the corridor, his expression calm but his posture tense, like a wolf ready to pounce. He towered over Lyra protectively, his steel-blue eyes locked on the Orakian. The general's molten lips curled into a sneer. Humans and their misguided heroics. He turned sharply, his heavy steps fading as he walked away, leaving a simmering heat in his wake. Marcus looked down at Lyra. "You all right?" Lyra straightened her shoulders, forcing a composed nod. "I'm fine." "Yeah, sure." Marcus smirked faintly, but didn't push her. He fell into step beside her as they continued through the corridor. "That was a hell of a speech, Princess. I don't think they'll forget it anytime soon." Lyra's gaze flickered to him. "You were supposed to be silent, observing, weren't you?" Marcus shrugged. "You looked like you could use a wingman." For the first time in hours, Lyra's lips twitched into a reluctant smile. "Thank you." Marcus grinned, satisfied. "So, what happens now?" Lyra exhaled, her steps slowing as they approached an ornate door leading to the private chambers assigned to the Skelna delegation. "The delegates will argue. They'll question my intentions. Most will dismiss me again." "And what do you plan to do about that?" Marcus asked. Lyra paused at the door, her violet eyes looking up at him with a quiet fierceness he hadn't seen before. "I'll show them they're wrong." Her words lingered, a promise more to herself than to him. Before she entered, Marcus said, "If you're serious about that, you'll need allies. Real ones." Lyra turned back, curious. "Allies? Who would align themselves with Eskelna?" "Me, for starters." Marcus's tone was casual, but his expression was serious. "You're fighting an uphill battle, Princess, but uphill battles are where humans tend to shine." Lyra studied him for a moment, searching his face for deception, but she found only sincerity. "Why do you care?" Marcus shrugged. "Call it human stubbornness. I don't like bullies, and I don't like seeing someone underestimated when I know they're stronger than they look." Lyra's lips parted, but before she could speak, a shout rang out from the other end of the corridor. "Princess Lyra, you're needed at once." A Skelna advisor rushed toward her, his expression panicked. "There's been a development in the forum. The Orakian general has challenged your claims, and the council has agreed to his terms. He demands a trial of merit." Lyra froze. "A trial of merit? What sort of trial?" "The Orakians believe strength is the only measure of worth," the advisor explained quickly. "You'll be expected to face their champion in combat tomorrow. If you refuse, they'll take it as proof of Skelna inferiority." Lyra's blood ran cold. Combat. The Skelna were a peaceful people, scholars and engineers, not warriors. She had no chance against an Orakian champion, a being twice her size and 3 times her strength. "Are they insane?" Marcus snapped, his tone sharp. "They can't force her to fight. This is a diplomatic council." The advisor shook his head. "The council has ruled it a cultural matter. If the princess refuses, it will disgrace not only her, but her people as well." Marcus glanced at Lyra, his brow furrowed. "You can't go through with this. It's suicide." Lyra's heart thundered in her chest. Refusing meant confirming the galaxy's opinion of her people. Accepting meant walking straight into defeat, or worse. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "I have no choice." Marcus's frustration was clear, his hands clenching at his sides. "Then we find a way for you to win." Lyra looked up at him in shock. "Win? against an Orakian. Marcus's expression was unwavering. You said it yourself. You're not like them. You're Skelna. You don't have to fight like they do. You just have to be smarter. Lyra stared at him, hope flickering faintly in her chest. Marcus crossed his arms, his tone confident. I'll help you, princess. If the Orakians want to fight, we'll give them one they'll never forget. The determination in his voice was infectious. For the first time in her life, Lyra didn't feel small. She didn't feel weak. And as Marcus's plan began to form in his mind, she realized something important. Humans didn't fight fair. Perhaps, just perhaps, that was the advantage she needed. The private chambers of the Skelna delegation were quiet, save for the hum of the city outside the window. Princess Lyra sat stiffly in a low-backed chair, her thoughts racing like a starship at warp speed. Across from her, Captain Marcus Hale stood with his arms crossed, brow furrowed as he paced the room. "You know this is insane, right?" Marcus said, his voice edged with frustration. "You're expected to fight a molten brute twice your size with muscles like reinforced steel. There's no universe where this is fair." Lyra met his gaze, her violet eyes calm but unyielding. "Fair or not, it doesn't matter. If I refuse, the Skelna will be shamed. My father's hopes will crumble, and my people will lose any chance of earning the respect we deserve." Marcus stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "You're stubborn. I respect that. But if you're going to walk into this fight, then you need to give yourself a chance to win." Lyra's lips quirked into a faint, skeptical smile. "Win? Against an Orakian champion? Marcus, I can't even reach his shoulder." "Then you don't fight his way," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "You're Skelna. You're fast, you're smart, and you're agile. You use that to your advantage. You don't fight fair. You fight clever." Lyra hesitated. The Skelna weren't warriors. They solved problems with their minds, with invention and ingenuity. They didn't train for combat, and she had never lifted a weapon in her life. As if sensing her thoughts, Marcus crouched in front of her, his tone softening. "Listen to me, princess. Battles aren't always won with strength. Back on Earth, humans have faced impossible odds for centuries. You know what we do when we can't overpower our enemies." "What?" Lyra asked quietly. "We outthink them," Marcus said, a determined fire sparking in his steel-blue eyes. "We find the one thing they aren't expecting. And we hit them where it hurts." Lyra stared at him, absorbing his words. It was impossible not to feel inspired by his conviction. "You really believe I can do this?" Marcus stood, offering her his hand. "I believe you're stronger than you think, princess. Now let's get to work." For the rest of the evening, Marcus worked with Lyra to develop a plan. They couldn't train her to fight like an Orakian. Not in a day, and certainly not in her lifetime. Instead, they focused on her strengths: speed, intelligence, and precision. "Orakians rely on brute force," Marcus explained, as they stood in the chamber's makeshift training space. "They're strong, but they're slow, predictable. They don't expect someone small and quick to dodge their attacks." He handed Lyra a small metal rod, shaped like a baton. It was light and easy to hold, the perfect size for her hands. "What is this?" she asked, inspecting the object. "Your weapon," Marcus replied. "Humans call it a stun rod. It won't kill, but it'll knock an opponent off balance, especially if you target the right spots." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "You want me to fight a molten giant with this?" Marcus grinned. "I told you, we don't fight fair. The Orakian will think you're weak and fragile. Use that to get close. Strike fast, strike smart, and stay out of his reach." Lyra exhaled, clutching the rod tightly. "And if I fail?" "Then you get back up," Marcus said firmly. "That's how humans do it." The hours passed in a blur. Marcus taught her how to move, quick, precise steps that would keep her out of harm's way. He showed her weak points to target, behind the knees, under the arms, and the small of the back. Each move was practiced over and over, Marcus patiently correcting her form. Lyra stumbled often, but Marcus never let her quit. Again, he'd say, his tone firm but encouraging. "You're getting there, princess." When exhaustion threatened to overtake her, she slumped to the floor, breathing heavily. "I can't," she muttered. "I'm too small, too weak." Marcus crouched beside her, his voice quiet but strong. "You're not weak, Lyra. You've spent your whole life surviving in a galaxy that refuses to see you. That's strength." She looked at him, her heart pounding for a different reason now. No one had ever spoken to her like that, like she was capable of more than the galaxy believed. And for the first time, she began to believe it too. By dawn, the time for preparation had ended. Lyra stood in the center of the arena of merit, a circular pit surrounded by towering walls of stone. Above her, the Grand Forum's delegates gathered to watch, some curious, others amused. The Orakian general stood near the far entrance, a smug smile on his molten face. "This is pointless," he sneered. "End this quickly." Ragnar. From the shadows emerged Ragnar, the Orakian champion. He was a living monolith, nearly 3 meters tall, his body glowing with veins of molten fire. His fists alone were the size of Lyra's torso. The crowd gasped at his appearance. Lyra's grip tightened on the stun rod. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. She could feel Marcus's eyes on her from the balcony above, his words echoing in her mind. "You don't fight fair, you fight clever." The announcer's voice boomed across the arena. "By the ruling of the council, the trial of merit will commence." Ragnar grinned, his molten teeth glowing like coals. "Try not to cry, little princess." Lyra said nothing. She raised the stun rod, holding it at her side. The signal sounded, and Ragnar charged. He moved like a mountain, his massive fists swinging with the force of an avalanche. Lyra barely dodged, rolling to the side as the ground shook where his blow landed. Dust exploded around them, and the crowd roared. Ragnar turned, slower this time, his molten eyes narrowing. "Run all you like. You can't win." Lyra didn't run. She danced. She darted left and right, staying just out of his reach. Each time he lunged, she was gone, his fists pounding the earth where she had stood seconds before. The crowd murmured in surprise. She was holding her own. Ragnar grew frustrated. "Stand still," he bellowed. "Now." Lyra darted forward, slipping under his arm as he swung wide. She jabbed the stun rod into the back of his knee. The electric shock crackled, and Ragnar roared, stumbling forward as his leg buckled. The crowd gasped. Marcus grinned from the balcony. "That's it, princess." Ragnar spun, enraged, his fists swinging wildly. But now Lyra was quicker, sharper. She darted around him, striking his weak points, his ribs, his arms, his lower back, each time leaving him stumbling, disoriented. The Orakian champion, who had towered over her just minutes before, was now panting, his movements sluggish. Lyra's chest heaved as she stood across from him, gripping the stun rod tightly. Ragnar roared one final time, lunging with all his weight. She dodged. With a swift, precise movement, she slammed the rod into the side of his neck. The shock sent him crashing to the ground, unmoving. Silence fell over the arena. Princess Lyra stood alone in the center, breathing hard, her small figure framed against the fallen titan. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd. From the balcony, Marcus smiled. "Told you they wouldn't see it coming." Lyra lowered the stun rod, her chest swelling with pride. She had won, not with strength, but with her mind, her speed, and her courage. For the first time, the galaxy looked at her not as a joke, but as a victor. The applause that had begun hesitantly in the arena now thundered through the entire forum. Princess Lyra stood still in the center, the stunned silence of her victory giving way to cheers. Cheers for her. The sound echoed in her ears, as alien as it was beautiful. Above, the towering delegates murmured among themselves. The Orakian general's molten face twisted in disbelief, his pride shattered as his champion lay motionless on the ground. Never in their history had an Orakian fallen to someone so small. From the balcony, Marcus Hale's smile was wide. His arms crossed as he looked down at her like a proud teacher. "That's my girl," he muttered under his breath. Lyra turned her gaze upward to the rows of delegates. Their expressions were a mix of shock, respect, and, for the first time, recognition. She had proven herself. The Skelna had proven themselves. The announcer's voice finally broke through the noise. "The trial of merit has concluded. By the laws of the Forum, Princess Lyra of the Skelna has emerged victorious." The words hit her like a wave, and her legs threatened to buckle. She had done it. Somehow, against every odd, she had won. As she walked back toward the chamber entrance, her steps were steadier, her chin higher. Guards opened the ornate doors to let her pass, and as she entered the corridor beyond, Marcus was already waiting for her. "You were brilliant," Marcus said, grinning like he'd won the fight himself. "Did you see their faces? They're never going to forget what just happened." Lyra leaned against the wall, the stun rod still clutched in her hand as she tried to catch her breath. "I still can't believe it worked." Marcus crouched in front of her, his voice quieter now. "Believe it, Princess. You didn't just win a fight. You changed the way they see you. The way they see the Skelna." Lyra's violet eyes met his, wide with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. "Do you think it's enough?" Marcus stood, offering her his hand. "It's a start, and sometimes that's all you need." She took his hand, letting him pull her up. Though her body ached, her spirit soared. For once, she didn't feel like a shadow in the grand halls of the galaxy. The aftermath of Lyra's victory sent ripples through the stellar forum. Delegates who had once ignored her now stopped to greet her in the corridors, their tones no longer condescending but cautious. The word princess was spoken with a new respect, her name whispered as though it carried weight. In her private chambers, a group of Skelna advisors surrounded her, their voices filled with excitement. "You've done it, Princess," one of them exclaimed. "The Alliance has agreed to reconsider our position in the Council." Another added, "Your father will be proud. For the first time in centuries, they're seeing the Skelna for what we are, a people of ingenuity and resilience." Lyra nodded, her heart swelling. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, but now that it was here, she couldn't help but think of the one person who had made it possible. Marcus Hale. Later that evening, Lyra found him leaning casually against a marble pillar outside the forum's central hall, as if he hadn't just helped rewrite the fate of the species. He looked up as she approached, a smirk already on his face. "To what do I owe the honor, Princess?" Marcus teased. Lyra folded her arms, though her tone was warm. "I wanted to thank you. Without you, none of this would have happened." He shrugged. "You did all the hard work, Lyra. I just gave you a nudge." She tilted her head, studying him. "Why? Why help me?" Marcus's grin faded slightly, his expression softening. "Because I've seen too many people like you, overlooked, underestimated, get crushed by this galaxy. People like you deserve a chance to fight back." Lyra's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "Humans are strange." "Yeah, we get that a lot," Marcus replied with a grin. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the soft hum of the city stretching around them. Finally, Lyra spoke again. "The Skelna will not forget what you've done for us, Marcus Hale." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his tone light but genuine. "Well, you'd better not forget me either. Who else is going to help you keep those molten brutes in check?" Lyra couldn't help but laugh, a soft, genuine sound that surprised even her. She hadn't laughed like that in years. But beneath her lightheartedness, something deeper stirred. Marcus had helped her accomplish what no one believed was possible, and for that, she would be forever grateful. And yet, as she looked at him, she couldn't shake the feeling that their journey together was far from over. Word of Lyra's victory spread quickly through the galaxy, reaching corners of space that had long forgotten the name Skelna. Delegations from smaller species began to send representatives to speak with her, eager to align themselves with someone who had stood against the giants and won. In the halls of power, the largest empires took notice as well. The Orakians, humiliated by their loss, remained silent but watchful, their pride too great to admit defeat. For Lyra, the days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and renewed purpose. The weight of her father's hopes no longer felt so heavy, it felt achievable. But in the quiet moments, when the delegates were gone and the lights dimmed, her thoughts always returned to Marcus. One evening, as the twin moons of the Forum world rose over the skyline, Lyra found him again. This time sitting on a balcony, his boots propped against the railing as he stared at the stars. "Planning your next battle, Captain?" she asked softly. Marcus turned, smiling. "Nah, just admiring the view." Lyra joined him, her gaze drifting across the endless expanse of space. "Do you ever wonder what's out there, beyond the stars we know?" "Every day," Marcus replied. "That's what humans do. We keep looking, keep pushing. Doesn't matter if we're small, weak, or outnumbered. We keep moving forward." Lyra smiled faintly. "Perhaps that's why you helped me." Marcus glanced at her, his expression sincere. "No, Princess. I helped you because you were already strong. You just didn't know it yet." Lyra felt her heart catch in her chest. She looked back at the stars, her voice quiet. "What happens now, Marcus?" He chuckled softly. Now we show the galaxy what happens when they underestimate someone." Lyra nodded, the hint of a smile on her lips. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this much. With Marcus at her side, anything was possible. And for the first time in her life, the galaxy no longer seemed too big. It was hers to conquer. The once dismissive halls of the Stellar Alliance were no longer cold to Princess Lyra of the Skelna. Her victory in the trial of merit had altered everything. Delegates who previously ignored her now paused to greet her with nods of respect. Smaller races, ones often overshadowed by giants, began to see her as a symbol of hope, proof that size and power alone did not determine worth. But where there was admiration, there was also danger. It began subtly, a whisper here, a shadow there. Marcus Hale noticed it first. As a soldier, his instincts were sharper than most diplomats could ever hope to be. In every meeting Lyra attended, in every corridor she walked, he saw it, the lingering stares, the tense silence, the growing hostility in the eyes of the larger empires, and in particular, the Orakians. "They're watching you," Marcus said one evening as they stood on a secluded balcony overlooking the glowing spires of the Forum city. Lyra tilted her head, curiosity in her violet eyes. "They've always watched me. Now they just know my name." Marcus frowned, leaning against the railing, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon. "No, this is different. They're not just annoyed anymore. They're angry. The Orakian general won't let this go." "I defeated his champion fairly," Lyra replied, her tone firm. "What more does he want?" Marcus turned to her, his face serious. "He wants revenge." The weight of his words lingered between them. Lyra's heart sank as she looked out at the sprawling city. For centuries, the Skelna had been invisible, forgotten. Now that they were seen, it seemed the galaxy wasn't ready to accept them. "I can't stop now," she said quietly. "If I back down, everything we've worked for will mean nothing." Marcus nodded, his voice steady. "Then we'll stay one step ahead of them. But you need to understand, Princess, this is no longer just a battle of words. The stakes are higher now." Lyra met his gaze. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying they'll come for you," Marcus said bluntly. "And they won't play fair. You need protection." The attack came sooner than either of them expected. It was late, and the Forum chambers were quiet. Most delegates had retired for the night, leaving the massive halls shrouded in darkness. Lyra, feeling restless, walked through the gardens at the base of the Forum complex. The night air was cool, the twin moons casting soft silver light on the delicate flowers and flowing fountains. Marcus had insisted she not wander alone, but she'd dismissed his concerns. "I'll be fine," she told him earlier. Now, she wasn't so sure. A soft rustle of leaves made her freeze. She turned slowly, her small fingers tightening around the edge of her cloak. "Who's there?" The shadows shifted, and from the darkness emerged three massive figures. Orakian enforcers, their molten skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Princess Lyra," one of them rumbled, his voice like gravel. "The general sends his regards." Lyra stepped back, her heart pounding. "You have no right to. We take what we want," the lead enforcer interrupted, stepping closer. His molten fists flexed, sparks falling from his knuckles. "And no insect princess will humiliate the Orakians without consequence." Lyra's mind raced. She had no weapon, no means to defend herself. Her first instinct was to run, but the Orakians moved to block every escape route. One of them lunged forward. Bang! The crack of a weapon echoed through the garden as a bright pulse of light struck the ground near the enforcer's feet. "Back off," a familiar voice barked. Marcus Hale emerged from the shadows. His Earth Coalition-issued blaster aimed directly at the Orakians. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "I said back off. Now." The enforcers hesitated, glaring at Marcus. "This is not your fight, human." Marcus smirked, stepping between them and Lyra. "Funny thing about humans, we don't like bullies. So, yeah, it's my fight." The lead Orakian growled, his fists glowing hotter. "You dare." Before he could finish, Marcus fired again, this time striking a stone pillar near the enforcer's head. "That's your last warning," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm. "Touch her, and I'll make sure you regret it." The Orakians glared at him, their molten bodies radiating anger, but they didn't dare move closer. Finally, the lead enforcer sneered. "This isn't over, little princess. The Orakians will not forget." With that, they turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Marcus and Lyra alone in the garden. Marcus turned quickly, his face still etched with tension. "Are you all right?" Lyra nodded shakily, though her hands trembled. I didn't think they'd go this far." Marcus placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his voice softer now. "They're desperate. You embarrassed them in front of the galaxy, and now they're trying to scare you." Lyra met his gaze, determination flaring in her violet eyes. "Then I won't let them. I won't hide, Marcus. The Skelna deserve better, and I won't let fear stop me." Marcus studied her for a long moment, pride flickering in his expression. "Then I'm with you, princess, every step of the way." By the next morning, word of the attack had spread. Delegates whispered in the halls. The Skelna chambers were placed under heavier guard, and tensions in the Forum grew thicker. Lyra remained calm, her presence in the council meeting steady and unwavering. But Marcus wasn't fooled. He could see the unease growing beneath the surface, the warning signs that the Orakians, and perhaps others, weren't finished yet. Late that evening, as Lyra prepared for another long day of negotiations, Marcus approached her. "Princess, we need to think ahead. The Orakians won't stop until they've undone everything you've achieved." "And what do you suggest?" Lyra asked. Marcus's voice was firm, unyielding. "We find allies. Real ones. There are others like the Skelna, smaller nations, smaller species who are tired of being pushed aside. If you unite them, you'll have a voice too loud for even the Orakians to silence." Lyra paused, considering his words. For centuries, her people had stood alone, invisible to the galaxy. But Marcus was right. Alone, they were vulnerable. Together, they could be unstoppable. She looked at Marcus, a new spark of purpose in her eyes. "Then let's show them, Marcus. Let's show the galaxy what happens when the forgotten stand together." Marcus grinned, nodding. Now that's the spirit, Princess. The Grand Forum of the Stellar Alliance was no longer the same. The tremors of Princess Lyra's victory in the trial of merit still shook the halls of power. Yet, beneath the shifting attitudes, danger lingered. In the days following the attack in the garden, Lyra and Marcus worked tirelessly. Marcus's plan to unite the overlooked races, species like the Skelna, was bold, but it was Lyra's resolve that turned the tide. She called for meetings in hidden chambers, far from the ears of the larger empires. Representatives from small, overlooked civilizations began to arrive, quiet, curious, but full of hope. The Teveriks, known for their inventions but mocked for their height. The Dralic, whose entire culture was dismissed for their pacifism. And the Zenthri, insectoid beings once brilliant scientists, now refugees. They all shared a common truth. The galaxy had ignored them. And now, they were listening. Lyra stood at the head of a long table, her small frame illuminated by the hololights. Marcus leaned against the wall nearby, his arms crossed, listening intently. "My friends," Lyra began, her voice carrying strength, "the galaxy has made us believe we are weak, that we do not matter. But I refuse to accept this. The Skelna are proof that size does not determine strength, and innovation is more powerful than brute force. Together, we can change the balance of power." A Tevrix delegate, his voice hesitant, asked, "But how, Princess?" "Alone. Our voices have been silenced for generations." "We are no longer alone," Lyra said firmly. "What they fear most is our unity. If we stand together, if we demand recognition, respect, and a place at this table, they cannot ignore us." Marcus stepped forward, his voice adding weight to hers. "Look at what happened in the trial of merit. The Orakians thought they'd crush her. Instead, she crushed their pride. That wasn't luck, that was strategy. And that's what this alliance will be about, being smarter, faster, and stronger together." A murmur rippled through the room. The smaller nations exchanged glances, and slowly, nods of agreement began to spread. Lyra felt hope swell in her chest. The Forgotten were no longer isolated. They were becoming a movement. But the Orakians had not been idle. General Taurak, his molten skin glowing with fury, had watched Lyra's influence spread like wildfire. He could no longer deny the threat she posed, not just to his empire, but to the old power structure of the Alliance. "This cannot stand," Taurak growled, slamming a molten fist into the stone table of his war council. "The insect princess has made a mockery of us, and the human has emboldened her." A subordinate spoke cautiously. "What do you propose, General?" Taurak's molten gaze narrowed. "We do what must be done. If she unites the weak, she must be destroyed before her alliance solidifies. The Forum will hear of her unfortunate demise." The attack came on the eve of the final council meeting. Lyra stood on the balcony of her chambers, gazing at the lights of Forum City below. Marcus was at her side, scanning the shadows like the soldier he was. "You did it," Marcus said softly. "Tomorrow, they'll hear your proposal. You'll have allies. You'll have a voice." Lyra smiled faintly, though her expression was tired. "And you made this possible, Marcus. I can never repay you." "You already did," Marcus replied with a grin. "You gave me a reason to believe in this crazy galaxy again." Suddenly, a faint hum filled the air, low, ominous. Marcus's instincts kicked in immediately. He spun, his hand flying to his blaster. "Lyra, get down." A plasma bolt shattered the railing where Lyra had stood seconds before. Marcus grabbed her, pulling her behind cover as more blasts rained down from unseen attackers. The air crackled with energy, and smoke filled the room. "They're here," Marcus growled, his eyes blazing with fury. Lyra's mind raced. "The Orakians." "Stay low," Marcus barked. He fired into the darkness, his blaster lighting up the chamber. From the shadows, armored Orakian enforcers emerged, their molten bodies glowing as they advanced. Marcus knew they couldn't hold them off for long. He activated his communicator. This is Captain Hale. Security breach. Orakian forces attacking Princess Lyra's chambers. We need reinforcements. Lyra's pulse pounded in her ears as Marcus fought. She could see the rage in the Orakians' eyes, the lengths they were willing to go to silence her. No, not like this. Lyra gripped the stun rod Marcus had given her days ago, her small hands trembling, but her resolve steady. She wasn't the same princess they had mocked. She had fought before, and she would fight now. Lyra, what are you doing? Marcus shouted as she darted out from cover. She moved quickly, weaving between the massive figures, her stun rod sparking as she struck at weak points, knees, backs, necks. The Orakians roared in frustration, unable to pin her down. Marcus fired with ruthless precision, protecting her flank as they fought together. Finally, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor. Reinforcements had arrived. The Orakians, realizing they had lost, retreated, leaving behind scorched walls and shattered glass. Lyra collapsed to her knees, breathless, as Marcus knelt beside her. "You're insane, you know that," he muttered, but there was a proud smile on his face. Lyra looked up at him, determination shining in her eyes. "They won't stop, Marcus, but neither will we." The final day of the council arrived. Princess Lyra stood on the central podium, flanked by delegates from the smaller species she had united. The hall was silent as she spoke, her voice steady and unwavering. "For too long, the voices of the small have been silenced," she declared. "But today that ends. The Sikelna, the Tevriks, the Dralic, we are not weak. We are the future, and we will no longer stand alone." The larger empires shifted uncomfortably, but many nodded in reluctant acknowledgement. Even the Orakian general, furious though he was, could not deny what she had achieved. The council voted that day. By a narrow margin, Lyra's alliance was officially recognized as a new faction within the Stellar Alliance. As the hall erupted in applause, Marcus leaned down and whispered, "Told you they'd listen." Lyra smiled, a single tear of pride sliding down her cheek. "We made them." That night, as Lyra and Marcus stood on the balcony overlooking the city, Marcus spoke quietly. "You changed everything, Lyra. The galaxy won't forget this. And neither will I," Lyra replied softly. "You were the first to see me, Marcus, to believe in me." Marcus smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Humans have a knack for spotting greatness when no one else does. And you, Princess, you're going to do incredible things." Together, they looked out at the stars, no longer distant, no longer out of reach. For Lyra, the galaxy was vast, but it was hers to shape. And for Marcus, he knew one thing for certain. The smallest fighter in the room had become its brightest star.